Welcome to this Digital Infra knowledge session, and we'd just like to thank Digital Infra for making this channel available. Our topic today is called Net Zero Energy Data Centres. I'm Damien Wells, I'm from Spark Communications, and I'm delighted to be talking to Ed Ansett. Ed is the founder of i3 Solutions. He's a well-known commentator on data center energy, data center power and infrastructure. I'm sure you all know him from the many conferences he's attended and spoken at. So great. After a decade or so of focusing on energy efficiencies, sustainability has suddenly become the topic on everyone's lips. Ed, you've mentioned that there are significant challenges to data centers becoming completely carbon net zero by 2030, but today we're just going to focus on reliable facility energy supplies without the environmental footprint that's traditionally associated with delivering services from data centers. And in the absence of current legislation, what's the business case for moving to low carbon assets? You've stated that sustainability also presents a revenue opportunity to commercial data centers. So how are people going to get an ROI from this?
I think there's a number of ways that this can be approached, depending on which data center user or type of user we're talking about. So if we're talking about for example, the hyperscale end users, sustainability is a very key part of their corporate objective, and because they are end users, they're in a position to do things which perhaps data center owners and operators are not as easily able to do, such as introduce technologies that generally we don't see in data centers just yet as a rule. It was also, for example, the use of fuel cells, the use of gas reciprocating engines to replace diesels, and large-scale battery energy storage. In terms of the owner-operators, the business drivers, the sort of economics are in many ways more difficult. These organizations typically also have a strong corporate sustainability agenda, but at the same time, they are organizations which provide data center services to end users such as hyperscale and cloud service providers. And this is more difficult for them because they are typically constrained by SLA, service level agreements, particularly in terms of the thermal envelope and to some extent the power availability figure, which means they don't have the same kind of latitude. So perhaps apart from the more obvious things such as improving energy efficiency and looking at the use of sustainable resources, I think demand side response is probably the most significant opportunity for the data center owners and operators to realize a financial upside associated with sustainability.
Standing in the shoes, for example, of the owners and operators of larger data centers, and people for whom uptime is the #1 objective, where do you think the low-hanging fruit is for them? Where would you start if you were one of those people? Where would you start your journey towards net zero on power?
Yeah, so as I sort of alluded to a minute ago, this is more challenging for them. The low-hanging fruit are to do things which, as you know, I mean, to adopt sustainable strategies. So things like BREEAM and LEED, that's a good start. To be looking at embodied energy, be doing all of those types of things. But the real opportunities for those guys, as far as I can see, are creating new revenue streams associated with operating data centers as microgrids, bidirectional microgrids. That's where I think the industry will go. Who's to say when? But there's a real upside of doing that, both from a sustainability point of view and from a financial perspective in terms of an owner and an operator.
But operating as a microgrid, so starting to generate their own energy, for the primary reason of powering the data center.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be, there's a number of ways this can be approached. One is to generate their own energy and have that as the primary energy source for the data center. Another way is simply to be able to support the grid by, for example, disconnecting from the grid, in instances where there's high demand on the grid, and operate the data center in island mode. And then, there's other things you can do as well, such as firm frequency response and providing energy through things like battery energy storage, kinetic energy storage, liquid air storage, and of course, then there's the generation, if it's through gas turbines or gas reciprocating engines, or indeed fuel cells potentially could be used to support the grid with short-term operating reserve, or even sometimes continuous power as well. So there's the opportunity.
I mean, typically, the on-site generating equipment that people have is diesel powered, so that's not exactly going to be a great win for the environment.
You wouldn't use diesel plant. You shouldn't use diesel plant in any of those modes. I'm assuming in saying this that the on-site generation plant, whether that's primary generation or standby generation, will be lower carbon than diesels. The diesels themselves, in most instances, although they are very high in terms of their carbon profile, their emission factor, you have to bear in mind that typically these, in the current arrangement, often perhaps operate just a few hours a year. So they're really not making that much of a difference in terms of a net plus or a net minus in terms of carbon abatement, because they operate so infrequently. What we're talking about here is a new way of doing things where those diesel generators are replaced with other means of generation, which could be standby generation, such as gas reciprocating engines, or it could be a combination of standby and primary and grid support, but you wouldn't do that with diesel generators because the solution is simply not a sustainable one.
I asked earlier about business model. I guess that the difficulty here is going to be that, who's going to pay for this? It's really going to need end user demand, isn't it, to make people shift from the old way of doing something to new ways of doing something, because someone's got to pay. I think
there's again, this is an important one. There's also could be resistance from end users to operators doing this kind of thing, because they're typically used to the operator providing energy without having to consider the operator also feeding energy back into the grid. So in theory, there should be plenty of reasons why the end users think this is a good thing, because it ticks a big sustainability box. But it does require a kind of shift in thinking, or a shift in contract provision to enable end users, to enable data center owners and operators to be able to do this with the blessing of their end users.
I think you've mentioned in the past things like energy mix. It's not that easy for any data center anywhere to simply source energy from sustainable or grid energy from sustainable resources. Can you talk a little bit about energy mixes?
Yeah, of course. So there's data that shows what the grid emission factors are with various countries. And what I mean by grid emission factors are the kind of the greenhouse gas fuel mix. So if you take any country, pretty much every country has got more than one type of generating system. It might be, for example, if you take the UK, you've obviously got nuclear, you've got gas, you've got wind, you've got a very small amount of hydro, but that's the energy mix. And each one of those components has an emission factor associated with it. So for example, I think there's a tiny bit of coal left in the UK. Coal is one of the most offending types of generation if you're not doing the CO2 recovery. And whereas something like nuclear is relatively benign, in other words, pretty low in terms of its good emission factor. So those things kind of come together to give you a good emission factor. Now, the good emission factors vary from country to country. So the UK is relatively clean. Brazil is especially clean because of its very high degree of hydro, and same goes for a lot of the Nordics. And then you've got other countries such as Indonesia, and others, they're at the other end of the spectrum, where their fuel mix is such that their grid emission factors are much higher. Their CO2 or equivalent CO2 is much higher. And therefore, the solution that you choose to implement in terms of sustainability has to be based on the grid emission factor in a particular country. It's not a one size fits all. It's not, gas reciprocating engines here, fuel cells here. You have to look at each instance to make a decision around the impact, the sustainability impact of the solution.
So really, kind of any service provider or anyone operating a data center kind of has to really understand the context in which that data center rests, don't they? This is going to be a lot harder than just sticking a few solar PV cells on the roof and saying that's a box ticked. Where do you think people need to start? Do they start with their customers? Do they start with their vision? Or is it going to take something like, and I know we don't really want to get into it, but is it going to take something like, legislation to drive this thing along? So
pretty much every company that we're involved with across the world has an eye on sustainability. They want to do the right thing. Where do they start? It very much depends on factors such as location, what can be done in that location, the availability of resources, whether that's water, electricity, gas, and so on. It's a bit of a complex mix. So, you typically, where do you start is you look at what is available to you in your location and what the technology options are, and then try to determine which of the technology options are most applicable to your location in the context of sustainability and financial viability. You mentioned legislation. I know I have fairly strong views on this because I believe climate change is so important, and data centers are such a significant contributor to the carbon issue, that it's simply just important, and it's simply necessary to ensure, if you really want to make a difference in terms of sustainability, you can't leave it to chance, you can't leave it to market forces. Market forces don't always point us in the right direction as far as sustainability is concerned. A lot of people think otherwise, but that's most definitely my view.
What about evidence? How is the industry going to turn around and provide evidence that the sustainability outcomes it wants to achieve, are actually being achieved?
I think probably that's a good question. I think it's probably going to be through an extension of the likes of BREEAM and LEED, and other types of frameworks like that. Currently they're very good, but in the data center context, which we probably need to see those frameworks extended to be more specific around data centers, to include the things like demand side response and energy generation, and the things that we're talking about today that to some extent aren't included currently. Probably the right way to do that.
So we need to start re-looking at the way that these things are assessed and certified and so on and reported.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in the context of data centers, I mean, typically with the likes of BREEAM and LEED, they're associated with buildings as a whole. Data centers are a very distinct category of building, and I think what the imperative for that is that data centers are such massive consumers of energy that merits them being treated separately and having some mechanism or adjustment to the framework which is specific to data centers.
Got you. So Ed, in terms of data center sustainability, what are we really talking about there?
So this is a broad area. What we've decided to do, by the way, is part of the GHG abatement initiative, the research program that I3 and EYP are running, is we put together a list of metrics. They're not unique, but a way of looking at the overall sustainability aspects of a particular solution, so thermal efficiency, electrical efficiency, the impact that the raw materials or the extraction of raw materials have on the environment, recycling, the amount of embodied energy, carbon payback, water use, all of these kinds of things need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at sustainability. It's multifaceted.
Got you. Covering a broad range of topics. So, and then the other question is, you mentioned earlier demand side response. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and how people can engage with that, or how you know, the owners of data centers can engage with it?
Okay, so grids around the world, electricity grids around the world, are generally decarbonising. Okay, and this is true almost everywhere. The introduction of renewable energy sources, whatever they may be, whether they're geothermal, whether that's wind, whether it's solar, possibly tidal, and all of these have an impact on the grid. And of course, the fundamental purpose of the grid is supply energy to its population, its people, and its industry. Okay? And the grid demand, the amount of energy required from the grid varies. It can vary according to time of day, time of year, particular events that are going on at the time. And yet at the end of that, the grid has got a finite amount of generation and you know, a number of generating sources that they can call on. Now, the energy sector as a whole, so not the data center sector now, the energy sector as a whole have responded to this by installing embedded generation, distributed generation. So these are typically private generation systems that are connected to the grid to provide either short-term energy response or long-term energy response to the grid when the grid has a particular demand. Okay, so this is something that's been going on for years, demand-side responses. There's nothing new. But in the data center industry context, it's very new. The opportunity exists to kill two birds with one stone. One is to be able to generate additional revenue for the data center operator owner by operating the data center as a microgrid if it's got the right type of sustainable technologies and energy storage, and at the same time make a positive contribution in terms of net carbon reduction. So that's what demand side response is all about in the context of data centers.
Okay, so thanks for explaining demand side response. We have a relative short time frame for this, don't we? I can't help thinking that 10 years ago, the big move towards energy efficient data centers was driven by the high financial cost of energy. Now we have the high environmental cost of energy, and we can't wait too long to do stuff about this. 2030 is a relatively short time frame in the life cycle of a data center. These things don't get turned over in 5 minutes, do they? So, if you're starting tomorrow, what's the first thing you do? Where do you start looking to try and make the data center more carbon net zero or shift towards carbon net zero on power?
So, I mean, the answer depends on whether you're an existing owner operator or you're building a new site, because the approach be very different. The existing owner operators, there are likely to be things that they can do, particularly in terms of amount of energy they consume, where they buy, the type of energy that they buy, in other words, buying renewable energy sources, although there is a caveat to that, that doesn't actually solve the grid problem, but it's a step in the right direction. And then also, the way in which they operate their data center, they can look at things like that, but they're very much constrained by their existing infrastructure and the legacy SLAs to a large extent. And that's not to say there's nothing that can be done. I'm sure there are plenty of things, but you're not going to be able to take those data centers and make them carbon net zero by 2030 or more likely any time. It's just not going to happen. The issues are embedded within the fabric of the existing data center. The newer data centers, well, the options are open there. I mean, those are the things we've been talking about earlier. How do you source your materials that go into your data center? There's a great case for building reuse rather than building new. In terms of, again, looking at the amount of embodied energy that can be saved by reusing as opposed to building from scratch. So there's lots of and far more options for the new data centers that are being built. I think the real question, though, is by 2030, which is a date that's being used to talk about a goal for net zero. My sense of it is, going back to the end users, hyperscale major cloud users, I think they probably will be able to do that. I think they will be, because they, to a large extent, they control their own destiny, and they aren't constrained in the same way as the operators and owners of data centers are, that have to have these rather onerous SLAs to deal with, which, as I mentioned before, is quite restrictive. So I personally believe this is if we take the data center industry as a whole, we will progress slowly in terms of carbon abatement. There'll probably be a step change, especially if government step in. That could change everything. If government legislation does happen, then the industry will be forced to move at a quicker pace than perhaps it might otherwise do. But I think it's going to be progressive change. So much in terms of the end users, I think, based on what we're hearing, it seems likely that they will get close to achieving their objectives, if not achieve them completely. As far as the owners and operators are concerned, well, there needs to be some changes there. One, in terms of whether they are willing to become microgrids and do some of the heavy lifting in terms of demand side response, and also whether their tenants, their clients, these end users, are willing to be more sympathetic towards the owner and operator sustainability objectives. And if they are, then they too can do things similar to the end users.
And if you're a customer to a data center or a consumer of data center services, are there any things you should be particularly looking for when you're selecting a service provider, or when you're negotiating with your existing service provider?
Well, I think a lot of them are already doing this. If we look at the RFPs that are coming through from end users, they are looking at the sustainability measures that the data center owners and operators are providing. But I just don't think it goes far enough. I think it has to be the end users that say to the owners and operators, guys, it's okay. You want to operate as a microgrid? We're going to be fine with that. At the moment, I haven't seen that. That'd be great to see. And then when it comes to other things, well, look, some of the sustainability solutions, the more sustainable solutions, are going to be more costly. Now, who's going to pay for that? Because at the end of the day, without legislation, then owners and operators have to consider their own well-being, particularly their financial well-being. So why would they invest heavily in a more expensive sustainable solution than they would otherwise have to? It would have to come from their tenants, their end users, their clients, saying, we insist that you use this type of sustainable solution or that type of sustainable solution rather than the one you're using. And we accept that comes with a cost premium.
Got you. So, I guess in terms of sourcing services, you won't be looking for the lowest cost of service, although that might come into your equation. You need to be thinking about the other things and then the cost, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that some of them do that. I mean, I don't. That is something that already happens. The point perhaps I'm trying to make is the weighting of sustainability in a decision. I don't believe sustainability trumps cost right now. Okay. Mm-hmm. Again, in the absence of anything forcing us to do otherwise, if we want to make a difference, that needs to be reconsidered.
So, in a sense, the argument is still, energy efficiency versus downtime, isn't it? The desire for uptime always trumped the cost of energy efficiency, and we're pretty much still in the same position. Yeah,
I think we are. I think there's a gradual move away from this, from what we can see. But you're absolutely right. I mean, reliability and cost seem to be the top criteria. Whereas surely if we as an industry are serious about this, and this goes across the board, not just organizations that control their own destiny, but those that have to look at the service levels and the RFP requirements of end users, we need to redraw the lines in terms of the level of importance that sustainability is placed in the assessment that you do.
Very good. Okay, thanks very much for talking to us today. Can you just say, you know, how can people find out more information about what i3 Solutions and EYP are doing with their GHG abatement?
Sure. So we're doing this, as you mentioned, we have a greenhouse gas abatement initiative, and the purpose of this, we're doing this with EYP in the United States, obviously i3 in UK and in Singapore. We're looking at the whole gamut of issues associated with different technologies and the application from a sustainability point of view and a financial point of view. Okay, and we're just trying to make sense of it for everyone, because we can't see that elsewhere. So that's the purpose of what we're doing. And the best place to get information, frankly, is our website, or EYP's website, where you can see what we're up to, download the papers. There'll be another paper coming up fairly soon, and there'll be a series of, I think we've got another 12 or so papers to publish in, you know, let's say before the end of the year.
Very good. Thanks very much, Ed.